When Paulson and Bernanke's bailout package was first passed, LaRouche warned that we would begin to experience a French Revolution type of situation. Quote, "You're headed for something like a French Revolution, and you're going to bring it on your own heads if you're dumb enough not to fight this bill and not to oppose it. There is no excuse for supporting this bill. None. There is no moral excuse for supporting this bill." End quote. Since then, none of Lyndon LaRouche's solutions have been taken up to deal with the collapse of the system, and the continued bailouts all over the world have only further aggravated the crisis. Over the recent weeks, we have seen a series of student riots and terrorist destabilizations in Greece, in Sweden, in France, and all over Europe, all responding to the worsening economic conditions and lack of competent leadership within the current crisis. Most of these riots began as legitimate peaceful protests, but were quickly infiltrated by the so-called Black Bloc terrorists deployed by European-wide anarchist networks to shift these demonstrations toward purgative violence and radicalism. In France, thousands of students turned out to protest Sarkozy's new austere budget-cutting reforms, which would eliminate 25,000 jobs in the educational field and would drastically cut down educational privileges for the lower 80% of the population. Following weeks of demonstrations by over 12,000 students and a closing down of many schools across the nation, President Sarkozy postponed and eventually canceled the school reforms. In Greece, protesters threw 2 firebombs at the French Institute in Athens, leaving a spray-painted message on one of the walls which read, "Spark in Athens, fire in Paris, insurrection coming." More violent riots scoured Greece and Sweden in the recent days, destroying public property, assaulting law enforcement officers, and engaging in violent battles on the streets. The collapse of the global financial system and the disintegration of the physical economy is dictating these protests, we see. As the crisis accelerates, as more and more of the population faces unemployment, foreclosures, and waning standards of living, there is an increase in the mass terror and violent reactions among the populace. The British Empire is working hard to take full advantage of this situation. Their system of globalization, speculation, and gambling is destroying this world today, and as this system collapses, they're doing everything in their power to create as much chaos as possible, including funding and catalyzing the recent violent student riots as well. According to Ioannis Makaletos, a former naval officer and security expert at the Research Institute for European and American Studies, and editor of the publication Southeast Europe at the World Security Network Foundation, these riots did not spring up from simple student rage, but were organized and funded by a pan-European-wide slime mold aimed at destabilizing governments across Europe. He says, quote, "The culprits in first sight are the leaders of the anarchist radical networks in Europe. Greek radicals are an important part of the European networks, along with their comrades in Italy, France, and Spain, the so-called Mediterranean networks. The other elements to be found are based in Germany and the United Kingdom. The former provided human resources, and the latter have already organized the so-called Antifa groups in Athens. So, we have a pan-European network, which is, to an extent, under the surveillance of the European intelligence services." End quote. Now, this is similar to the way such destabilizations have been run by the British throughout history, from the French Revolution to the Young Europe and American anarchist networks in the 1800s, to the radical Slavic and Balkan networks around the turn of the century, the fascist networks in Germany and Italy following World War I, and the anti-human environmentalist 68ers in the United States and Europe. And we see how this arm of imperial policy continues through to today. Historically, this is but one face of the empire's multipolar deployment to create the maximum amount of chaos within a region, to force nations to focus in on local turmoil rather than uniting together as a world of sovereign nations to solve the current economic and political collapse. We have a situation where there is no competent leadership in the United States, Europe, and Asia, or elsewhere to be seen. The entire financial system is collapsing, and most importantly, it is the collapse of the physical economy, the collapse of jobs, the destruction of our bridges, the takedown of our rail systems, and the collapse in trade, and the drastic drop in living standards, and the fact that nobody seems to be doing anything about it, which is creating the conditions for social unrest, the conditions where legitimate protests can be steered into violent ones for British geopolitical ends. Students graduating from college find themselves unable to find a job. They find themselves in massive amounts of debt and having spent the past 4 years or more of their life with no more knowledge of how to get civilization out of the current crisis we're in. They are the perfect target right now for this new move toward fascism. This is a French Revolution type of situation. Now, if instead of that, we're going to have an American Revolution, the solution is simple and clear. Competent leadership must be asserted to deal with the financial collapse. Lyndon LaRouche's solution for a bankruptcy reorganization of the world financial system and a new Bretton Woods agreement between Russia, China, India, and the United States to rebuild our physical economy must be taken up.